stillness is not an empty void that has nothing in it. It's actually the space that has everything in it. And so when we transcend the thinking mind, and we have these very limited, we call them vasanas, which are tendencies of the mind. And our mind has 50 to 60,000 thoughts a day, but 85 to 90% of those thoughts are deeply conditioned and coded into us by other pieces of information. So if you're listening to a podcast, you're listening to me or Dr. Espen talking. If you're reading an Instagram post, you're reading someone else's content. If you're reading the newspaper, if you're watching TV, again, your thought space has been hijacked pretty much 90% of the time by other pieces of information that other people have thought.
Welcome to the Dr. Espen podcast. I am Espen. Today I have the privilege of having a conscious conversation with Mr. Tom Cronin. Tom has spent 26 years in the financial markets in Australia, particularly in the leading bond and swap markets. But then he discovered meditation in the early stages of his career, which then completely changed his relationship with anxiety and stress and chaos that he was experiencing before he tapped into these powerful methodologies when he actually reached the crisis point. And now we're going to have a conversation about how you, no matter where you are in life, no matter what you're experiencing in life, if it's stressful, not stressful, if you're fulfilled, not fulfilled, if you're successful, not successful, whatever you perceive, how we can use some of these most powerful tools to have an incredible experience in this human experience, but also to improve our health and quality of life as we use these tools. Tom is the founder of the Stillness Project. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think personally for me, I've seen so much busyness in the world, in my own world and in the world of my patients and students. So today we're going to have a conversation about the power of stillness. So do tune into this and see if you are able to be present with your breath as we go through it as well. Tom's ongoing work has been transformational in both leadership and coaching in the corporate world and in the private world. He's done transformational work for companies like Amazon, Oracle, Harvard Business School, Qantas, UBS, Coca-Cola, and the list goes on and on. Tom has published 6 books and also produced the hit film The Portal, amongst many others. I want to say special welcome, Tom. How are you today, mate?
I'm very well. It's great to be. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
As am I. We had a quick chat just before we pressed record, and I think this is a really pertinent conversation in the time that we find ourselves now in humanity, with so much stress and so many busyness and so much busyness and so many things happening. I want to just quickly ask you, before we start unpacking the big stuff, the 7 states of consciousness, what is spirit, what is soul, what is consciousness, all these most amazing conversational topics. I want to ask, excuse me, how did you make that transition? What was the experience for you to change from being busy, and successful in the corporate world to want to tread this beautiful spiritual path?
Yeah, I think the overarching response to that is the universe, with its incredible, caring, divine, loving intelligence, guided me. And it guided me through some very difficult times, some dark times. So I was in finance. I was deep in the world of the late 80s, early 90s hedonism that was rife through the finance industry as a broker, very Wolf of Wall Street on trading room floors, doing lots of drugs, drinking, partying, really deeply immersing myself in the satiation of the senses, looking for pleasure, looking for deeper and deeper levels and greater sources of pleasure, which is where most of the world's at right now. And the universe is very good at letting us know when we're not on the right path, when we're going down a path that isn't really the path that we're actually here incarnated into physical form for. We're not actually here to satiate some senses in temporary pleasures. We're actually here to discover the fundamental truth of life and reality. And so that darkness, which was mired in anxiety, panic attacks, depression, insomnia, agoraphobia, even verging on suicidal tendencies, really contemplating whether I wanted to continue on with my life. And it was in the bleakest, darkest time where I'd had a nervous breakdown. I'd been put in front of psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors, put on medication, that I came across a documentary about a successful property developer that was building high-rise buildings in Sydney and Melbourne, Bruno Grollo. And in this documentary about him, I think it was on 60 Minutes at the time, and he talked very briefly for 40 seconds, a minute, about how he used the word transcendental meditation as a tool to help him with his success. And for me, this idea of transcending, because I was so deep into the drinking and the drugs, but in a spiritual sense, was just this incredible epiphany where I felt really drawn to, I need to explore what this is. And that's when, for the young kids who won't understand this, but I pulled out the Yellow Pages book, you guys call it Google, and I looked up meditation, and that's when I started to explore deep down the rabbit hole of Eastern philosophy, meditation, spirituality, and it was a game changer for me.
Isn't that incredible? There's nothing like a universal lesson or two, big or small, to get us away from a path that doesn't serve us into a brand new path. So I just want to check in on this. You mentioned briefly before we started the recording the different 7 states of consciousness. Can you talk to me a little bit about these 7 states and what this means? And then let's talk about, no matter where people are at in terms of their spiritual path, in the beginning stages, middle or advanced, how we can deepen that step. So let's start with talking about the 7 stages of consciousness, please.
Yeah, so these are recognized states of consciousness under the Vedic worldview, which is a vast body of knowledge that's been passed down teacher to student for around 5,000 to 6,000 years. So it stood the test of time because of its deep sort of understanding and appreciation of the science of life. And what it recognizes in the Vedic worldview, that we generally have access as a full realized human being, someone that's fully aware and awake to the absolute fundamental reality of life, that they're seeing life through these advanced states of consciousness. But for most of us who have yet to realize those states of consciousness, we're experiencing only 3 of those 7 states of consciousness. The thinking state, I think, therefore I am, and all our thoughts generally revolve around the identity, the ego, the personality. We have feelings, which are what are inspired by the thinking. So thinking inspires the feelings, and feelings inspires the thinking. Those two work very much together. We've got the physicality. So these are 3 forms or layers that we exist within. But the states of consciousness that we're in is thinking state, deep sleep, which is when we drop into deep state of unconscious awareness. So we don't even exist in deep sleep. We have no idea that we're in a soft bed with a nice fluffy pillow under our head. We just are completely unconscious. And then we've got dream state. So thinking state revolves around ourself. Deep sleep, we're unconscious. Dream state, all our dreams revolve around ourself again. So that individualized egoic identity reemerges in sleep, but just in dreams this time. So all our dreams revolve around ourselves. And so all humans move and cycle through those 3 states of consciousness on a daily basis. And that's where 99% of the world are limited to their current existence, that they have thoughts, they have deep sleep, and they have dream state, and they move in and out of those states of consciousness. But when we start transcending in meditation, going beyond the thinking mind, we start to access a 4th state of consciousness now called Turiya. Turiya means the 4th, which means beyond thinking, deep sleep, and dream state. So now we have a state of consciousness where we're awake, but not having a thought. And this is a very new phenomenon for people, and most of my students who learn my transcending meditation will experience Turiya in their first weekend workshop, where they now exist without the thinking mind. And if you exist without the thinking mind, you also exist without the feeling or emotional body. And that means that you're just experiencing a divine blissfulness. And then when you integrate that on a daily basis, morning and evening, dropping into Turiya, dropping into Turiya, dropping into Turiya, this eventually becomes stabilized and emerges as a 5th state of consciousness, where now we have the deep, a silent witnessing, which is non-thinking mind, just conscious awareness, simultaneously with thinking mind at the same time. And it's like there's clouds in the sky, but there's also the sky. And now we're starting to realize that we're the sky and the clouds in the sky. So we have thoughts and we have consciousness itself. Thoughts are in the consciousness. And then what happens is when we go into more advanced states, so that's the 5th state of consciousness, otherwise known as cosmic consciousness, in that it's whole. We have thinking mind and conscious awareness simultaneously at the same time. And then over time, we start to have this capacity to witness the world outside of us in another way, where we no longer see just the form and the phenomenon. We start to see the subtlety of that form, which is we're seeing the divine in everything. We're seeing the quantum level of existence happening in the tree, in the wind, in the smell of a rose, and in the cranky person that's screaming abuse at you because you didn't do the right thing at work. And so you start seeing this non-subjective, purely objective, non-relational reality that's outside of you, which is just the divine manifest in form. We call this Leela, the dance of the divine. And in the final state of consciousness, which we're seeing a lot more of people access this, it's very rare, very few people access it. Traditionally, people who went into this very advanced state of consciousness would only live in monasteries and ashrams. They didn't have jobs, they didn't have families, they didn't have to change nappies, they didn't have to deal with traffic lights and emails. But unity consciousness, non-duality, non-egoic existence is a state where almost they're occupant free or egoically free of the constraints of that individualized construction. And they're now really representing as custodians of the divine through a particular form. It's a very advanced state to get into that. There's not a lot of humans on the planet in that state, but there definitely are some humans in that state at the moment.
Would you say it's possible to exist and or tap into that state in the modern world?
I do believe, we're in this transition period where we're going from Kali Yuga, the age of ignorance, which is where 100%, well, let's just call it 99.999% of the world's population are in only those three states of consciousness. And we had this minute, tiny group of people that lived in ashrams and monasteries for the last few thousand years that were in those advanced other four states of consciousness. But now we're seeing this incredible paradigm shift where we're seeing spirituality, breathwork, meditation, yoga, plant medicine, healing modalities all starting to integrate into the world. I've been working with some of the biggest companies in the world, Amazon, Oracle, Boston Consulting Group, who are wanting to learn some of these techniques. And by default, their staff are going to start accessing some of these techniques. And so what we're going to see and what we are seeing is more and more humans of the integrated lifestyle starting by default to access a lot more of these advanced states of consciousness. Now, we don't really have a blueprint of how to coexist in the world in these states, but we're starting to work this out. So I think there are definitely people that are doing it successfully. I think people like Eckhart Tolle, I think Adyashanti, I think Rupert Spira, I think Mooji. Some of them are monastic and some of them are householders with children and wives and businesses. And, we've got Tenzin Palmo, who's a beautiful female Buddhist monk who's living in the world. Ama, the Hugging Ama, is very much living in the world and running businesses in these beautiful divine states of consciousness. So I believe it's possible. I think we really want to aspire to that as a species. And I think there's a possibility for us to live on an enlightened planet as we see more humans get into these states.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And isn't it interesting too? I mean, I had a similar path. I think we just briefly shared a few words earlier today where, I was in the corporate world similar to you, not in finance, but I was in health and education, successful and very busy. And then I had to take a good hard look in the mirror and ask myself, am I truly happy? Am I truly fulfilled? And the answer was a deep no. So my path was, different, but, in a similar way where I decided to sell up everything that I had and take 2 years off to quote unquote find myself. My journey began as a one-way trip to Peru, deep into the Peruvian jungle, to sit on the ground, to do, 20 days of water fasting, to, dive into the plant medicine world and see what that could bring me. And it just revealed to me that I was living out of alignment with my truest signature, with my truest essence, which is spirit. And it brought me back step by step to peel back the layers of whatever that conditioning was, to come back to that beauty, to that wholeness, to that simplicity. So I thought I'd want to ask you this question, because at the moment when we're observing the world and we're seeing what looks like madness and chaos, potentially being a symptom of where humanity is at, what role does meditation, and also may I ask specifically in terms of TM, transcendental meditation, play in that? How can we dance in both worlds successfully, so to speak?
I think it's a must. We must dance in both worlds. It's not how do we, it's like we must do that. And all suffering is two things. It's karmic responses to actions, but it's also a methodology that the universe has to guide us to stop being distracted, to stop doing what we're doing, and to look to another way of being. and it doesn't give up on us. All karmic, all chaos, all turmoil, all conflict is simply a methodology, an intelligent system that is supporting us. And unfortunately, we're just not very good at listening. That's the problem. So we keep getting more and more chaos, more and more turmoil. And I had 10 years of being completely stubborn and ignorant and like sticking my fingers in my ears and not listening to the universe. So the greater we adapt, the greater we tune in, the greater we listen, then the less chaos, turmoil, and pain and suffering and disease that we're going to have in our life overall. But I think where Transcendental Meditation comes in is it's one of the tools, and I think you're right on the money. I believe it hasn't been my path at this point in time, not to say it won't be at some point in the future, but plant medicine hasn't been something I've experienced. But what I'm gathering from the information I've received from it is another portal. That's why we call it up on the portal, because it's an entry point to a realm that we need to start accessing. There's a world beyond physicality. There's a world beyond your Bitcoin, a world beyond your car, a world beyond your ice cream, a world beyond your KFC, a world beyond who's going to get voted in an election. Now, we need to address the physical world and the world of form and phenomenon and be in that world. But we also need to understand that there is another layer that we need to start realizing and be part of that experience.
And, you know, you say it so beautifully, humbly and gently, yet so powerfully at the same time. But I just really want to double down on this because part of what I teach is if you go back and you look at Max Planck, for example, who became the father of quantum theory well over 100 years ago. He won a Nobel Prize when he was able to quantify and provide evidence, scientific evidence for quote unquote, a field of divine intelligence. Call it the unified field in science or consciousness or spirit or God or, you know, however we want to kind of, you know, label it, which is, of course, labeling the unlabelable. But nonetheless, we know that this exists. And so, you know, even if I say to people right now, if you go to your chat GPT or whatever tool and you Google what percentage of my atoms are made up of empty space, you'll get 99.9%. So in essence, we know through science and perhaps also through spirituality and maybe even intuition, that we are consciousness. We are made up of 99.9% non-physical intelligence. And only this tiny percentage of us is physical in nature, be that the five senses and how we, you know, you spoke so beautifully to the stimulation of the senses. And I did the same thing, you know, drinking alcohol and running out and, you know, doing all these things to try to stimulate the senses when the purpose is not to stimulate the senses. The purpose is to perhaps experience and explore something else and something deeper, something more meaningful and profound. So I just wanted to give a bit of scientific context to what you're discussing and speaking to here, because it is proven. And I agree with you. We need to take that path. And at some point, I believe the universe may serve us more challenges / opportunities for growth if we veer off the path of truth and the path of you know, self-realization as such. So I wanted to ask in this regard, now that we know science has supported this, it is a journey that we'll have to take. You mentioned the Kali Yuga and the end of the dark age. We're now transitioning into a new age. Can you talk to us a little bit about what this means? Because I know the ancient Vedic scriptures are really strong on this. The Mayan calendar ended December 2012. We're receiving a lot of light into the atmosphere. It literally is a light age if you look at it from that perspective. But I wanted to ask your opinion on the matter. Where is humanity now? Where are we going? What are your thoughts?
I like to use an analogy at this point to give the listeners something to, I guess, identify with and grasp. And we use the analogy in my film, The Portal, which is a bit of a shameless plug, I know. But we use the analogy of the caterpillar that morphs into the butterfly. And so if we look at that transition, it's not a black and white transition that happens. There's a caterpillar and next thing it's a butterfly. It's a gradual process that goes over quite a long period of time. And what happens in the caterpillar is that the caterpillar is basically a net consumer. It just gorges and gorges, and it's eating that forest faster than the forest can actually, reproduce itself. And if it was given that capacity to, it would basically eat the forest into extinction because it just consumes and gorges for its own personal satiation. And that's what corporations do. It's what politicians do. It's what individuals do, is we just simply are so self-obsessed and so consumed by our own personal identity needs, whether it's, again, our company or our sports team or our business or our nationality. We generally identify with the I and me. And this is what the caterpillar does as well. But what's happening in the caterpillar is really interesting because what we find in the caterpillar is it's accumulating amino acids. And what happens in that caterpillar is these early imaginal cells of the future version of that caterpillar start to emerge. And these imaginal cells are the initial cells of the butterfly starting to coexist in with the caterpillar, because it's getting ready for its transition to the butterfly. And so the imaginal cells of the future version of self are starting to emerge. Now, the existing immune system in that caterpillar see those imaginal cells as a threat to the current status quo. So they begin to annihilate, assassinate, crucify, or incarcerate these imaginal cells that represent a new status quo, which has been happening for the last 4,000 years. As we see, anyone that represents a new status quo has literally been annihilated by the system that likes the system as it is, because they thrive in the system being what the system is, because they created the system. Now, what happens in the imaginal cells is that they start to congregate, communicate, collaborate, and they proliferate through this collaboration and communication. And what happens over time is that they start to gather such momentum that they have the capacity to overwhelm that resistant immune system and overpopulate. I did a post on this actually yesterday, where the unfamiliar becomes familiar only when the familiar joins the unfamiliar, because the unfamiliar looks so good. And so we need to stay with our path, to be true with being the unfamiliar, because if it's inspiring enough, you'll get the familiar to join the unfamiliar, the normal to join the abnormal. Then the abnormal becomes normal. And this is where the tipping point, the chrysalis moment takes place. And then it becomes the butterfly. Now it's this beautiful thing that starts to propagate and help the forest flourish. And we're actually not past the chrysalis moment yet, unfortunately. We have still a great capacity to self-annihilate, because not all caterpillars actually turn into the butterfly, because the resistant immune system is so strong that it can eliminate the potential for it to become the butterfly. So we could see World War III, we could see AI completely eradicate us, we could see environmental catastrophe, we could see all sorts of anomalies because of our stupidity and our ignorance and our resistance to adapt and change and become the butterfly. So we're not past the chrysalis. We still have a lot of work to do to get across that threshold and make the unfamiliar familiar. But it's by people listening to this podcast, you doing your work, DeMartini doing his work, that we're seeing the proliferation of the unfamiliar gathering so much momentum that I believe personally we're going to see the chrysalis, and we're going to see that transition into an enlightened planet.
Brother, I truly do believe that we are experiencing as we speak. And with what you've shared, I couldn't agree more. But what are your 2 cents worth on the end of the Kali Yuga, the end of the Dark Age, coming into the Age of Aquarius, seeing more light entering the atmosphere? What's your personal hypothesis on the matter in regards to the transition from an old chapter into a new chapter?
Well, what we're already seeing is that it's happening at a grassroots level. It's not going to happen from the top down. We're just not going to see politicians and oligarchs and major media outlets and major pharmaceutical companies and, major military industrial complexes say, hey guys, we're actually thinking about just closing everything down and starting again and rebuilding the system from the ground up from an enlightened viewpoint where we're all part of an equal society. It's just not going to happen. But what we are seeing is not yet. But what we are seeing is an incredible grassroots shift happening. We're already seeing people pulling out of the education system and starting to do a lot of, hey, I want to start re-educating my children my way. And maybe what I'm already seeing is a lot of people doing homeschooling, but then the homeschooling gathering such momentum that now we're seeing collaboratives happening in the homeschooling where people are going, hey, there's 10 people doing homeschooling in my local neighborhood. Why don't we create our own little classroom? So we're seeing the education system starting to be rebuilt. We've got the media system, which was TV, magazines, and newspapers and radio, now being rebuilt. We've got Telegram, we've got Signal, we've got even Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. So even though they might have become oligarchs in their own right, but they're still alternatives to the old status quo that Rupert Murdoch might have owned. We're seeing new paradigms to the finance system. We've suddenly got cryptos, and no one can shut down cryptos. They can try as much as they like, but the digital currencies, whether they're created by a government or whether they're created by some guy in the back room of a in his bedroom on a laptop. We're seeing alternatives to this. So we're already seeing an undermining and a recreation of the old systems with new systems, because the consciousness of the masses is starting to change. And as the consciousness of the masses starts to change, what they create and do and build starts to change as well, because it's an extension and expression of the state of consciousness of those masses. So we're seeing this already happening. It's already in play. We've got 100 million people on the car map. We've got people doing plant medicine. We've got major venture capital funds looking at investing in, how to mainstream plant medicine. How do we mainstream meditation? And we're seeing this happen very, very quickly just in the last 5 years. So I can only see in the next 10 years that we're going to see things like these practices integrating into organizations, into governments, into schools, and the shifting of the consciousness of the masses starting to change. And there's a really great, just for everyone to listen into this part, there's a really great contemporization of this, which is the movement from game A into game B. And you can simply go to game B wiki and you can start joining in the conversation of what game B might look like for civilization. There's some brilliant minds on the planet. One of them's in our film, Daniel Schmachtenberger, that part of the brain's trust to create a new system and a new way forward for a win-win paradigm for an enlightened planet.
I love this. And as you mentioned, it's already happening. So it's kind of like I say to my students as well. One, we can sit back and relax and do nothing. I'm pretty sure the man upstairs or the woman upstairs or the creator of all things have got this one covered. But I, for one, also want to be a meaningful part of the evolution of humanity from, an age of forgetfulness to an age of what I call coming home. I think this is incredibly important, and, far from being an abstract notion and discussing deeper, more profound and fundamentally true spiritual concepts. I think it's also vital to understand or understand this comes back to an incredible quality of life. This comes back to, as I say, when I'm meditating in the morning, when I'm doing my breath work and my prayer, my son is observing me having a connection to spirit, and when he sees me, doing a blessing for my food and imprinting my water with this love and appreciation, he's understanding, he's witnessing a relationship to everything and everywhere all the time. This devotion to unity consciousness. And I think this is important for parents to consider and for leaders to consider also, because we are being witnessed. And it's not as in what are you doing, but it's in there are people out there now that are like you, Tom, who are providing the opportunity to access the limitlessness of this divine consciousness through applications that are free of charge. And it's just mind-boggling how simple it is. And so my question to those watching and viewing right now, if you can just take a note, what is your practice to connect to spirit? What is your practice to be still? What is your practice when it comes to your own spiritual path and development? What have you devoted yourself to? I'd like you to maybe pause this podcast and take a note or discuss with the people next to you. What are you doing now? And how will you continue to deepen your devotion to yourself and to your creator and to the field? I think this is really important, because as we take that step, we're more and more, as I say, we're coming home. So Tom, you said shamelessly plugging the portal. I think it'll be shame not to talk about it. Just quickly, what is the portal? Tell us a little bit about your work, and then I'd like to ask some questions about stillness. Please take it away.
Yes, the portal is a film that we made that explores 6 real-life stories that all went through crisis. And we went through many, many stories from all around the world, and we chose these very specific 6 stories that covered a lot of the global crisis themes, from war to human displacement to personal physiological tragedy. And all of these stories have a crisis within them, and they all have a redemption, a transformation, an alchemy from that crisis into a new way of living. And they use a methodology called meditation. So the portal is going into that transcendent experience in meditation, liberating themselves from the actual cause of the crisis and the outcome of the crisis to a new way of living. And we look at that through the lens of the individual 6 stories, but also through humanity's macro impending crisis and current crisis that we're facing. And it couldn't become even more relevant than we made this, about 5 years ago now. And it's available at the moment for free on our website, entertheportal.com. But it's a beautiful, rich film that really gives the viewer the opportunity to contemplate what are you doing to transform your life and liberate yourself from the shackles of the past, and realize that what's available to you is a blank canvas of what you want to create in the future. And what we do today is going to determine a lot of what the outcome of our future looks like. And so it really explores a lot of those concepts in the film. And the reason why we made that was to really, my strong vision and passion is to inspire 1 billion people to meditate daily. This is the tagline of the Stillness Project, that I could see a lot of the world's problems coming from a place of disconnect. And when we sit in stillness, we find that deeper level of connection. And one thing the world's riddled with now is distraction and noise and stimulation. And what that's doing is it's moving us further and further from that center and that being. And meditation, I find, is one of the great tools that helps us reconnect into that.
Yeah, I don't think meditation's important. I think it's an absolute necessity. And meditation, as I say, and maybe you'll correct me on this, but the mind is not always supposed to be still. We don't always access that state where it's complete stillness, presence, and unity consciousness. Even if we're just sitting in stillness 5-10 minutes a day, we're aware that we're breathing in, we're aware that we're breathing out, and then the mind wanders, and then we just bring it back. We're still meditating. We're still learning to master the subtle art of being present. And I think this is critical because it gives us the opportunity to access those superhuman states. Now, this might be a benefit for those watching. You might be, after peak performance. You might be after optimal health. You might be after, scaling your businesses and doing amazing things. You might be after impact. You might be after something even more simple and even more beautiful, perhaps. But nonetheless, the practice of mindfulness, presence, and meditation, you can't get around it. It is a non-negotiable. So I just wanted to ask you, sir, stillness. I remember when I did my first 10-day Vipassana, which I highly recommend. If you're in Australia, I practice regularly at a place called IMC, International Meditation Center. And of course, there are Vipassanas around the world. You could just look it up. It's one form of meditation. I remember when I did my first 10-day silent meditation retreat, day 2, stiff and sore in the back and, whatever. And, the mind is racing and doing its thing. And then I'm coming into day 3, day 4, and I've sensed this deep connection, the amount of grace in my being that I've never had before. And it opened up this incredible realm. And I had transcendental experiences. I had healing experiences. I had experiences of letting go. And I had this beautiful nervous system connection to divine consciousness. I received more information in stillness in 10 days. Not that this is the purpose, but it also took place. More information, answers that I needed in 10 days than I had in the last 12 months of trying to find solutions. So I wanted to ask you, you've done this for a long time. Can you tell us, please, about the power of stillness?
I'd love to start with a quote from Oprah Winfrey, who does these deep transcending meditations. She says, word for word, the constancy of stillness. It is only from that space can you create your best work and your best life. And there's a reason for that. Stillness is not an empty void that has nothing in it. It's actually the space that has everything in it. And so when we transcend the thinking mind, and we have these very limited, we call them vasanas, which are tendencies of the mind. And our mind has 50 to 60,000 thoughts a day, but 85 to 90% of those thoughts are deeply conditioned and coded into us by other pieces of information. So if you're listening to a podcast, you're listening to me or Dr. Espen talking. If you're reading an Instagram post, you're reading someone else's content. If you're reading the newspaper, if you're watching TV, again, your thought space has been hijacked pretty much 90% of the time by other pieces of information that other people have thought. So we have very limited thinking capacity. And even in the 5, 10, 15% that's left of free thinking, perhaps by chance you might just be sitting on a bus without your head in a phone or listening to a podcast and sitting there for a small window of time to contemplate, or when you put your head on the pillow finally, your mind finally has some free room to think. We generally stay within a very close confine of the thinking space. But when we drop into these deeper spaces of stillness in transcendence, where the mind goes beyond the fluctuations of thinking, we access the entire field of infinite potential and creativity. So everything that's ever been cognized and manifested and created was created from that field of possibility and potential, which means that everything that's going to be created and manifested will be in the field right now as well, which gets us really excited because it means that it's infinite what's in there and what can be created. So stillness is, interestingly, like you said, when we dive into it, we get incredible creative epiphanies and visualizations, problem-solving capabilities, adaptive capacity. It's bursting with incredible potential. And it's something that obviously at times when we drop into it, we get bumped out of it because we get so excited by the thoughts that we have when we get into it. So it's an interesting conundrum that we face sometimes when we go into those places. But I like to play in that sort of space in my meditations of dropping in and coming out with cognitions and dropping in and coming out with cognitions. And I find that is how I manage to write books and films and write retreats and coaching programs, etc.
This is beautiful, Tom. Who are some of the people that you're following now that you were to say, for those already on the meditation path, which I know many of our listeners and viewers are, who perhaps want to deepen their practice, what are some of the resources or people to follow or look out for?
I think, you can't go past Eckhart Tolle as far as the wisdom and the philosophy of now. I think it's hard to beat people like Rupert Spira, Mooji, who's a great sage of our time, Adyashanti, another brilliant sage of our time. We've got previous sages who, interestingly, all have Instagram accounts. We've got Ramana Maharshi, who's a wonderful non-dualist and enlightened master, Paramahansa Yogananda. There's a beautiful divine feminine goddess who's been a great saint of the past, Sri Sri Anandamayi Ma. I highly recommend looking her up as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. What's next for you, Tom? Where to from here? I know you do some amazing work with sharing this to people, and in a minute I'll be talking a little bit about where to go to get more information about Tom, about his work, about his coaching, about his meditations. But what's next for you now?
So I teach meditation for people that would like to learn this technique to transcend in meditation. That's either on Zoom or in person. I see some of the biggest changes in people's lives when I put them through my retreat process, which is a combination of breath work and yoga and meditation and workshops and talks. And we're doing a lot of retreats next year in USA, Dubai, Bali, and Australia. We just had a Bali retreat sold out last 2 weeks ago. So I'll be doing a lot of retreats going forward, and also bespoke retreats for people who want tailor-made retreats anywhere in the world for their organization or an individual. And then a lot of what I'm doing these days is working with other conscious leaders, so yoga teachers, meditation teachers, breath workers, healers, that are kind of struggling to get their message out to the world, struggling to get their business off the ground, or are in corporate and want to make that transition like I did. So helping them just with the basics, how to get your website up and running and your social media strategy and create your business model around that so that they can sustain themselves financially in a way that, enables them to make a big impact in the world and be able to feed their family at the same time.
So, Tom, I'd like to ask that these retreats, these sound phenomenal. It's interesting. I love studying synchronicity and hyper synchronicity. I love when people are in alignment and things happen and we see a synchronicity. I always say, whoop, there it is again, because I don't think synchronicities are random. I believe they're signs from spirit that we're working a aligned path, that we're connected with people. And similarly, I do retreats in both Bali and Dubai myself. So I'd like to just, for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, where do they go to learn more about your work, specifically your website, your socials, and so on?
The two places probably the most effective and efficient would be to Instagram at Tom Cronin, one word, TomCronin, and then my website, one word again, tomcronin.com. It's an easy one to remember, and you can find me on both of those places.
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I've got one final question for you. But before I do, I'd like to ask if there's anything else that you'd like to add, considering the time that we're in, the space that we find ourselves in, all of the above. Anything else you want to share, please?
I guess the thing that comes to mind is that it's very easy to see the chaos and the mayhem and the discord that's happening on the planet. And I think we're going to see more of that going forward. We're going to see extreme weather conditions. We're going to see a lot of human displacement. We're possibly going to see some major conflict because there's still a lot of ignorance in the world and a lot of separation, perceived separation anyway. And it's easy to get lost in the tragedy of that, the pain of that. I get a lot of people coming to me go, I don't even know if I want to live in this world. It's too bleak. It's too hard. But if we really just pull back our gaze and look at things over not just 100 years, 500 years, but look at the eternality and the magnitude of the universe and the solar systems and the galaxies, and realize that the microscopic nature of the human existence and the temporary fleeting nature of the human existence, and that what we can do is to be sovereign in our own state first and foremost, to make the unfamiliar become the familiar by staying true to being the light. The world doesn't need more suffering, so don't want to contribute to the world's suffering. We want to find our divine nature, find our unconditional lovingness, and walk tall in that, walk firm in that, and become the true custodian and embodiment of what is truth. And then that, in turn, over time, will enable the world to transform by each individual transforming themselves. And just remember that the lamppost is most effective on a dark corner. And so if it's dark, then just be the lamppost, and it's not affected by the darkness. In fact, it realizes its greater potential by being in the darkness. There's not much relevance to the lamppost if it's bright, shiny light in the daytime. So just keep being the lamppost, and know if there's darkness around you, then that's okay.
I'm just going to be silent and still just for a quick moment. I'd just like listeners and viewers to just tune into what was just shared. How do you get to be that lamppost, that light in the darkness? Just by being you, by tuning into the beauty that is you. I love that. I absolutely love that. I'm going to listen to that over and over again. So again, if you guys want any more information, let's have a look at some details. What do we got? Tom Cronin, CRONIN.com/meditation-retreats. You can learn more about the Zen Academy for spiritual leaders on tomcronin.com/Zen-Academy. And also, as Tom has said, his socials and so on and so forth. Tom, thank you for making the transition. Now, thank you for making the time to be here with us and share these powerful tools with us. I would like to recommend, if I may, to the listeners and viewers to listen to this as many times as necessary, to perhaps feel it in your heart, to share this interview with 5 or 10 people that might be stuck in fight or flight, and or share it on your socials and get it out to as many people as you can, because you never know how far sharing something as profoundly powerful, beautiful, and yet simple as this could benefit other people's lives. So I've got one last question for you, and I'd like to ask you straight off the cuff. Are you ready?
Go for
Let's do it. Okay, here's my question. Tom, I want you now to imagine that you are on the so-called world stage. Every sentient being alive has gathered, they're watching, they're tuning in to your message to the world. Whenever you're ready, take a breath and do share, Tom. What is your message to the world right now?
Everything that you're looking for is right here. But we have to go deep into it. And we can't find what we're looking for in our phone, in a shopping mall, in a bottle of alcohol. Everything we're looking for is here. It's just that we have to shift our attention from out there to in here. Whatever methodology you use and whatever teacher you need to support you with that process. But we don't get anything new in this path. We actually release what we're not. And what that does is it reveals what we already are. We are already enlightened, and we are already the lovingness of being.
Tom Cronin, thank you. My heart feels full, my mind feels grateful and equilibrated, and I just want to say it's been a privilege having conversations like this. I wish you the absolute best on your path. You've got my number. Let's stay connected. I want to get this work to as many people as I can for the benefit of everybody. So thanks again for taking the time to be on the podcast today, mate.
Thanks for creating the space. It's not often we get conversations like this that get inspired by people like yourself asking these questions, and it's only coming through me. It's not from me. So thank you for providing the opportunity and the space for this to come through me.
It's a privilege, sir. Until next time, Tom Cronin, everybody.